Hi guys, so here it is as promised, my review of the brand new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie that was dropped on Netflix at the end of last week. And if you haven't seen it already, I did drop my review of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre here on this channel last week, so don't forget to go check that out if you haven't already. Before we get started on the review of the movie, I just want to address the fact that this film seems to be a divisive one. Just as Malignant and Halloween Kills was last year, people either seem to really love it or hate it, and unfortunately in some cases are being unpleasant to people who have a differing opinion to them. I understand that it's going to be difficult to remain impartial when it's a movie or a franchise that you are passionate about, and it's probably going to be unpleasant to hear someone talk negatively about a movie that you love, but the truth of the matter is we're not all going to love the same things. But what's so incredible about horror movies is that there is something for everyone, and while we may have differing tastes and differing opinions, we can still bond over our shared love of this incredible genre. So with that in mind, this review is going to cover both positives and negatives because in my opinion there are both to be found in this movie. Okay, so Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022 was originally intended to have a theatrical release in 2021, but this was cancelled and it was exclusively released on Netflix this year. It currently has a Rotten rating of 29% on Rotten Tomatoes and an audience rating of 36. However, I'm sure that is bound to change as the movie has only been out for a handful of days. As Gunnar Hansen and Marilyn Burns have both sadly since passed away, their roles of Leatherface and Sally were recast with Mark Burnham and Alwyn Fowler. John Larroquette returns though as the narrator in the opening of the movie, and he also narrated the original, the remake and the beginning. Okay, so let's start with some positives of this movie. My biggest positive about this movie has to be the way that it looks. There are some absolutely stunning visuals throughout this film. Some of my favourite shots are when Leatherface pops up out of the sunflower field and when he's walking out of the sunflower field and there's dark clouds and a storm rumbling above him. It's incredible imagery representing the oncoming storm that is Leatherface, and I also really loved the shot where Sally has driven to the crash site of the van and she's walking through the sunflower field and she's illuminated by the headlights of her car. The use of light is really nice too. The majority of the film seems to have this really lovely dusky golden glow to it, which really helps everything feel warm and run down. Some of the camera angles and cinematography in the film, especially earlier in the film, did really remind me of It Chapter 1 from 2017, in particular where the group of 4 young adults arrive in Harlow and the shots of brick walls with sort of rotten away pieces of paper, and I thought, okay, who's done this film? And I actually had to Google it, but it was nobody to do with it, but honestly some shots early on feel like they could have just been lifted from It Chapter 1. I did really like the creative choices behind a few of the shots in this film as well, especially when it's Dante's kill and you see the attack unfold as the kitchen door is swinging back and forth. I really liked that one. Another positive for me with this film is how it's very evident that the filmmakers have tried to make this movie feel as though it fits in the franchise naturally. So you have a kill in the kitchen, and a lot of the exterior shots of Sally's house really reminded me of previous Sawyer houses, especially the original and the remake. There are a number of parallels and references to the other movies in this film. Another one that springs to mind is the line of dialogue in the beginning of the film where the local cops refer to Dante as the cook, which has to be a reference to Drayton Sawyer in the original and the second one. The actual opening of the movie has a lot of parallels with the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well. So for example, you have a group of young adults, they're on a road trip through Texas, they stop at a gas station, we have interior shots of the vehicle while they're chatting amongst themselves, and then we also get lots of wide shots of the Texas countryside. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre tried to capture and portray a lot of the feelings and attitudes of the time, and there are a lot of layers of messages and themes within it, and because of this it has been studied by scholars and movie buffs alike, and this new release does seem to attempt to do the same thing. There's quite a lot of meta and social commentary within the film. You have the people on the bus live streaming Leatherface, mentioning cancel culture, cop brutality, and the effects of late stage capitalism, and I do appreciate that the movie attempts to do this, trying to be in keeping with this franchise's origins. But as to how effective they do it, I'll get into that later on. I do love this idea of bringing back the original final girls years later and seeing how their lives have been affected by what happened to them, as we saw with Sydney and Laurie and now with Sally. But as with the social commentary, I will get into it later, how well I feel they did with bringing Sally back. The kills in this Texas Chainsaw Massacre are absolutely incredible. There are very, very few copy-paste repeat kills, and there is a large variety of methods and weapons used. And that first kill, whoo-wee. Okay, so the movie was building it that you could see something coming, but I didn't see that coming. The filmmakers decided to go with practical effects for this film, and I think that it really pays off. The kills do look incredible, to the point that when Richter gets Negan'd, that was a little bit too much for me. But if you're a gore hound, then I'm sure you will absolutely love and appreciate the kills in this film, because there are limbs and innards flying all over the place. I think that the ending was actually a pretty good sequence, and I liked the sound design of the chainsaw motor and the dripping water in the background. And I also thought it was great how the movie led us to believe that we had two final girls. This really helped build up the last shock of the movie. And there was a moment there where I thought, wow, is this film actually finally killing off Leatherface? But of course not, and we get our final jump scare and shock of the movie. Now, I did kind of see it coming just because of the camera angles and the dead space in the shot, but that doesn't mean that I saw that coming. That end scene was absolutely brutal and made me go whoa out loud, and I think if we're honest with ourselves, that is exactly the reaction that filmmakers are looking for. And my final positive is that of Leatherface. I think, in my opinion, this is a pretty solid interpretation of him. Leatherface is considered to be one of the tallest horror villains, and Mark Burnham stands at 6'4", just like Gunnar Hansen did, so he's maintaining that intimidating stature. And to say that this character is an older version now, meant to be in his 60s, I believe, this is still a villain that is very much to be reckoned with. He is still running after his victims while holding a very heavy piece of machinery and lifting them up in the air. The original movie set up Leatherface as this almost childlike character who had what seemed to be learning difficulties, and in this version those characteristics have remained. This Leatherface both struggles to understand situations that he's in and then cope with them afterwards. So for example, when his carer Virginia dies, he's trying to help her by repeatedly pushing the oxygen mask into her face, because he's obviously seen that this has helped her in the past. And he also becomes very distressed when he sees the bus load of party people. What's interesting about this film is that we see this Leatherface grieving for his loss of his carer Virginia, and we see him grieving in usual ways, like smelling her toiletries and holding her clothing close to him, but also in very unusual ways, as in cutting off her face and wearing it. Okay, now for a couple of mixed aspects about this movie. Okay, so my first mixed aspect about this movie is only a small one, granted, but I feel it is a fair one. And that is, would you really, out in the middle of nowhere, in a place that you don't know, start talking trash about some random stranger who is stood right behind you? Especially when considering that one of these characters has just found out that a known local killer is still on the loose. This Texas Chainsaw Massacre also seems to want to make a very clear contrast between rural life and city life. You have the characters from the city judging a lot of the local characters. There's comments about some of them being nihilistic and not having any consideration for the environment. And there is one comment made by Dante when stopped by the local Texan police about making sure that you have your hands where they can see them. But then some of the rural locals do make judgments of the city people as well, calling them self-righteous and smug. And I just don't really get it as a plot point. It never really seems to go anywhere. Another thing that never really seems to go anywhere in this movie is how when we first see Sally, she's wearing a blood stained apron and is butchering an animal. I wondered if this was meant to be drawing mirror imagery between Sally and Leatherface, maybe making a comment on how she is butchering this animal in the same way that Leatherface did to her friends in the original movie. And perhaps this Texas Chainsaw is also trying to make a comment of pro-animal rights like the original did. But it is just such a small scene and doesn't really do anything. Okay, and now for that bus scene. Now, first off, I want to say the image of all these people on the bus lifting their phone and live streaming Leatherface, and the guy sniping at Leatherface that if you try anything, you'll be cancelled, bro, obnoxiously threatening him with cancel culture. Very, very funny. I really liked this. And I really love the setup of this scene visually. The majority of the movie has had this dusky glow and everything has seemed burnt out and run down, trying to emulate the aesthetic of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This setting is the world of Leatherface, and then you have the world of the modern city people. And this is represented by the interiors of the bus, where everything is lit up with neon lights. It gives everything this purple hue to it, and with that and the fact that there is a mobile phone in the hand of everybody on the bus, this really represents the modern day and technological world. And the imagery of these two worlds colliding was just brilliant. And kill-wise, you do get quite a mixed bag in this scene. Initially, it's not as in your face. The kills are more subtle, with bits of blood being splattered about, but it does very, very quickly amp this up, and the kills become much more brutal. It's not long before you have bodies being chainsawed in half and limbs flying everywhere and blood splattering everywhere, and all the while these people are trapped in the bus and trying to crush each other as they're trying to get out of it. So there were some creative choices about this scene that I did really enjoy, but overall it just ended up being a little bit too much for me. I felt as though it went on for a little bit too long. I felt that the kills became a little bit too much, and by the end of it I felt like it was me that was drenched in blood and body parts. And my final mixed aspect about this movie is the end credit scene, where we see Leatherface walk into what I can only assume is the Sawyer house and leaving a nice little opening for a potential sequel. But what? The Sawyer family are all dead now? So why was Leatherface in the orphanage and not in the Sawyer house? We had so much heaped on exposition and backstory for all the other characters, but none for Leatherface. And yes, I am in the party that says that you don't always need a backstory for villains. When you over-explain things, you do often lose that level of mystique and of terror that the villains can portray. But because of this end credit scene, because of seeing the Sawyer house, I need a bit more. I would have enjoyed a little explanation as to Leatherface's situation, even if it was as simple as explaining why he ended up in Harlow. And finally, let's talk about some of those negatives in the movie. Okay, as with my mixed aspects, my first negative is only a small one, but it's one that just irritated me. Through the course of this franchise, we have seen some pretty weak uses for the flashbulb sound. I'm thinking of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 4, where it was used as the background sound for prom photos being taken. But this movie, hands down, has the dumbest use of this sound that I have ever seen. They put the flash bulb sound over them opening the lid of a barbecue. So when I was writing up my notes that I made while I was watching this movie, I had written, could this movie be any more on the nose, and exposition overload. So screenwriting for this Texas Chainsaw Massacre began in 2019 and the filming of it happened in the summer of 2020. So the writing of and filming of this movie happened during a very volatile time worldwide, and I feel as though this movie is really trying to reflect that. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre also tried to capture and portray the troubles that America was experiencing at the time the movie was made. But the difference is what that movie did was they did this in a very smart and a very subtle way. I mean, in this film, you actually have one of the local characters say to the group of young adults, so you guys are what, like a cult? And they respond, we are idealistic individuals who want to build a better world. I don't need to be told, movie. Stop ramming it down my throat. We also have a lot of heaped exposition within the first 8 minutes of this movie as to who these characters are and why they've moved there. But the problem is, it comes across as a little preachy because of the heavy-handed script and the clunky dialogue. I just want to read you some actual lines from the beginning of this movie. We have, so, Harlow is a ghost town. Yes, but we have a vision for this place. All it needs is young blood, people like us tired of the big city looking for a fresh start. This place is for people to start fresh without the violence and madness. Again, you're telling me everything's script, you're not showing me, and it instantly makes me think that they're not going to get to do any of this. And also it doesn't feel natural that Mel would be telling her sister Lila these things, because surely if she has been buying this plot of land and buildings over the course of months, wouldn't she have already explained to her sister what was happening and why they had driven 7 hours to this town? And it's such a shame, because there are points in this film where the script shows me that they can do dialogue well, that they can show me rather than tell me. So a couple of examples are when Mel is talking to Dante and says that for the price that we pay to just rent a truck in the big city, we have been able to buy an entire corner of this town. This is good script, more of this. You're showing me in a very organic way a reason why they would want to move to this town. Another example is in the car when Lila is looking at anti-violence footage and posts on Instagram as she just carefully moves her shirt over her skin, and we see that she has a healed bullet wound. Again, this is a good way of showing us and not telling us why this character in particular might want to leave the city, why she might have a motive for moving to this town. I didn't mind the majority of characters in this film. They are what they are. They're nothing special, but they're not terrible. But one character that I really struggled to like was that of Mel. I found her irritating and her dialogue clunky, and I found that she was really over dramatic in the majority of situations that she found herself in. When her and Dante are looking for the deed to one of the buildings in the town, she tells him, "I'll never relax until I know I'm on the right side of this." I also never understood why Mel continuously seemed to be exasperated by her sister Lila. There was lots of dialogue towards her, lots of comments towards Lila about how she's incapable of looking after herself and how she's a screw-up. But as far as I understood, the only thing we really knew about this character was that she had survived an attack on her school, and I don't understand how surviving this makes her incapable of looking after herself. The script for me is the biggest negative about this film. There are just so many inconsistencies and oddities to it. So you have the repeated comments towards Lila about her being a screw-up and incapable of taking care of herself. You also have the girlfriend of Dante going off in the sheriff's van to the hospital. Why would you do that? You don't know these people. You don't live in this town. It didn't make sense. You also have the physically changing creaky floorboards in the orphanage, where they only creak when it serves the plot purposes. You also have the fact that none of the surviving characters think to go and check on the girlfriend who left in the sheriff's van. None of them are ever told that she was killed. And then you also have the strange comment made by Lila, who earlier in the film says to Mel that she's going to move back with their dad. But then later on, when they're trying to hide from Leatherface, she tells Mel that she's all that she has left. As with a lot of horror movies, there are a lot of dumb decisions made by the characters in this film. So, for example, when Mel and Lila have the opportunity to leave Harlow safely, for some reason Mel decides to drive at Leatherface and crash their car, what appears to be their only means of escape from this town. But the worst has to be the many bad decisions made by our returning final girl, Sally. I mentioned earlier, I think that this is a great idea. Let's revisit these characters and see how they're doing after the traumatic events that they've been through. But I just don't think that they portrayed this Sally very well in this film. This character leaves her house with a bag full of weapons, but when she eventually goes after Leatherface, she takes one gun and she doesn't shoot him. She stands there talking at him and then for some reason allows him to walk past her to go and attack the women that she herself left locked in her van. Sally then saves the women and tells them to get out of there without her taking any more weapons or ammo from the van. I expected her to run out of ammo when attacking Leatherface, and lo and behold, she does. We're led to believe that she has been waiting for 50 years for this moment. 50 years to find and seek revenge on Leatherface. That's a lot of planning time. You can get a pretty good plan in place in 50 years. But when it comes to it, she doesn't seem to have any plan and just makes dumb decision after dumb decision. I also think that the trailer for this film really played up the return of Sally, and I expected her to have a much more prominent role in the movie, a lot like Laurie did in Halloween 2018, but the truth is she's barely in it. And it's a shame too to see such wasted potential and for it to end the way it did, with Sally being killed and literally thrown out with the trash. And my final negative is again just a small one and just something that I personally didn't like, and that is the end credits, also known as an epileptic's worst nightmare. It is full of erratic jump cuts and flashing lights, and it makes it an unpleasant watch and really difficult to read the text as well. Again, it's a shame because I did like how they sampled in the flashbulb sound into the score, but yeah, for me personally, it just wasn't a fun watch. So there you have it guys, my review of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022. Overall, I think this is a pretty middle of the road movie. There are plenty of positives to be found, but there are also lots of negatives. And I think what really let this movie down the most was the oddities and inconsistencies in the script. I'd love to know what you guys think about this film. Did you love it? Did you hate it? But if we are going to talk about it in the comments, as always, remember to remain civil. My next episode is either going to be a ranking of all of the Leatherfaces or an episode dedicated to my horror movie collection. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on those. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.